Are you gonna join us? We have Pepe's foot again in the background. I'm sure you guys are all gonna stare at that instead of me the whole time, which is fine. So I went to go write out this video and like plan it and everything, and then I realized it felt a little familiar, and I was like, have I done this video before? So I did a little, you know, when you've been on YouTube and doing these kinds of videos for years, I think I've done horror videos for 8 years now, you're bound to kind of forget ones that you've done and like try to do them again. And so I looked back, and it turns out I did this last year. Just in 2019 is the last time I did this, or the only time I did this video. So we're gonna do a part 2 to this video. This is gonna be 10 more best horror remakes. And it was sad too, because I had already made my list and like half of them were already on my other list, obviously, because those are like my favorites. So I'm gonna do 10 more that are different from the last video. I will link it if you want to know 10 I think it was 10 in the other one, 10 other best horror remakes. You can check out my old video on that. I promise I'm still gonna do worst horror remakes. I just didn't really want to do a super negative video when we have a sponsor for the video. Thank you, Shudder, for sponsoring this video. So Shudder is of course a premium streaming service for all things horror, thriller, and suspense. Their collection includes blockbuster hits, horror classics, and lots of exclusive and original content such as their Creepshow series, which is amazing, and Tigers Are Not Afraid. This year Shudder is being a little extra for Halloween because it's just one of those years, so they are turning their usual 31 days of Halloween into 61 days of Halloween. They're featuring weekly original and exclusive movie premieres such as H.P. Lovecraft's Color Out of Space, and of course so much more, including 61 days of daily recommendations from Shudder's curator Sam Zimmerman. Personally, my favorite thing that comes out, well actually I think it's a year-long thing, a year-round thing that Shudder does, but this is my favorite time of year to utilize it. It is the Ghoul Log. It is a Halloween themed you know, like the Yule log Christmas kind of thing where it's the fire crackling, but it's a jack-o'-lantern, and it's amazing. Also, they recently posted 2 I think exclusive ones, original, and that is Spiral and also the Cleansing Hour. Both of these look amazing, so I'm so excited to watch these. Those are the top 2 on my list right now. You can stream Shudder completely ad-free on all of your devices, including iPhone and Android, Xbox One, Amazon Fire TV, Roku, Google Chromecast, all for $5.99 per month or $56.99 per year. But of course you can try Shudder for 30 days if you go to shudder.com and use my code POSSESS30. So let's get into these horror remakes. Now please keep in mind, every time I make these kind of videos I get comments. This is just my opinion. A lot of these are gonna be controversial opinions. I'm not saying these remakes are necessarily better. Maybe this first one is better, but not necessarily better than their original. They're just good remakes, done well, entertaining in their own way. But by all means, please leave your opinions and thoughts on these movies, but also share your favorite horror remakes in the comments. So first up is a controversial choice, and that is Child's Play, which came out in 2019. And I think people who grew up loving the original Child's Play franchise were really huge fans of this movie, and understandably, because they changed so much about it, but it was more so a reboot than a direct remake. It is more of a reimagined story. They got rid of the main plot of the Chucky doll being possessed by a serial killer. Instead, this is more of a, I can't say possessed, AI that's evil. Is kind of more commentary on our consumerist mindset and technology and things like that. This one does star Aubrey Plaza and Mark Hamill as the voice of Chucky, which I think both are very interesting cast choices for those roles, not predictable at all, but I think they did really well with it. I personally enjoyed this movie more than I thought I would. I like the original franchise. I recently got into it and watched it for the first time, and I appreciate it. Obviously I didn't grow up, you know, loving it, but I really enjoyed the remake, or the reboot rather. I liked the modern take on it and all the updates they did to it and the changes that they made. They made it very modern. Will it age well? Probably not, but if anything, they made it a little bit darker than the original and more gory and more of a thriller type. It has the comedy aspects in there as well, because obviously the Child's Play and Chucky franchise is known for being kind of campy and comedic at times. If I remember right, the best scene in the whole remake or reboot is the first death scene, and it doesn't really get as good as that throughout, which was kind of disappointing, but generally I liked the gore and the death scenes and the horror elements that they added to the franchise, so I think this is a great remake. Next up is the Amityville Horror from 2005. I recently just rewatched this the other day because my boyfriend had never seen it, and for me personally, it's a good go-to kind of movie. It's like a comfort movie for me. I watched it so much in high school, like on repeat. I was obsessed with that movie, so anytime I don't really know what to put on, I put on Amityville Horror sometimes. This, of course, is the telling of the Lutz family that moves into the home where Ronald DeFeo murdered his family, and this is based on a true story and was investigated by Ed and Lorraine Warren. There is controversy around this particular case, whether or not all of it was true. I did a video on Ed and Lorraine Warren already. That's kind of, I get a lot of hate on that one, but I'll link it if you want. I kind of talked about the Amityville Horror case in that video, but you can look it up yourself. There's some interesting side details going on with that case. But obviously this movie is just like loosely based on that story because this is not what really happened. Now, this is the 9th Amityville Horror in the franchise, so does it really add anything new to the franchise? Absolutely not. It doesn't. It doesn't reimagine anything really. It modernizes it a little bit, given it was 2005 when it came out, and given that it was 2005, obviously I'm gonna like it. But I genuinely think that the acting is actually really great. It stars Ryan Reynolds and Melissa George, and I think they have amazing chemistry together. I think they work really well together and were very believable as a real life couple, and their acting was phenomenal. They carried this movie hands down. Young Chloe Grace Moretz is in this as well. Now, I haven't seen all of the original Amityville Horror movies. It's not really my franchise. Older movies, like, you know, those kind of franchises aren't really my thing. I like 2000s, 2010s. We all know this by now. But this movie, I think, was genuinely well done. I can't really compare it to much of the original or the original franchise, but as its own movie, I really, really love this. It does have some early 2000s cheese, especially any scenes with the priest for some reason are just like over the top and very cheesy, but I love this movie. Next up is Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2003. So this is the 5th installment in the Texas Chainsaw universe. And while the original will always be my favorite, it's one of my favorite horror movies of all time, I think the remake from 2003 was actually done really well. Again, this is a 2000s movie, early 2000s movie, so it has some of that going on, but I liked the updates to it, the changes that they made. They made this a lot gorier and darker, very gory compared to the original. There's really not a lot of gore in the original, which is surprising for how dark and kind of messed up that movie is. Also, a lot of the original crew from the Texas Chainsaw movie worked on the remake. Tobe Hooper served as a co-producer on this, so I think that makes it that much better. I think first glance at this kind of movie, especially given the era, people are going to assume it's really cheesy, and it doesn't necessarily live up to the original because the original is such a classic and so amazing. So I don't think it necessarily lives up to it, but if you watch it for its own movie, it definitely has a similar kind of, sorry about my neighbors walking around, similar kind of gritty, dark nature that the original had, but with a lot more gore and death scenes. I think the first scene with the hitchhiker, that scene, I can't get it out of my head. It's very, very disturbing and unexpected given if you've seen the original hitchhiker scene, which is one of my favorite scenes of any movie of all time. Funny enough, the screenwriter for this movie, Scott Kosar, also wrote the screenplay for the remake of Amityville Horror. And he had said that the movie should try not to compete with the original, and I think that's really important when you're going into doing a remake, is to make enough changes but not make it too far off from the original, because you do want to get those old school fans in to see the movie too. You don't want to just appeal to a newer audience. The only exception to this that I can think of is the remake for Funny Games, which I talked about in the first video, which is one of the best remakes hands down. It is shot for shot, the American version, the American remake is shot for shot the exact same as the original movie, which is very daring, but it was done by the same person, shot in the same house, same location. So many critics think the remake of Texas Chainsaw was completely unnecessary, and I think that goes without saying for all of these movies. Any kind of reboot or remake, a lot of people are going to see it as unnecessary, especially if they are fans of the original. Maybe if someone wanted to remake The Ring one day, I'd be a little like, well, make it good, and maybe think it was unnecessary, because I love that franchise so much that I don't know what they could add to it or, you know, reboot about it to make it entertaining. I don't know. Anyway, let's move on to the next one, which is Quarantine, which came out in 2008. This is the American remake for the Spanish film Rec, which I think is equally as good. I'm more drawn to the American remake because I watched this in high school and became obsessed with it and have rewatched it so many times. The original is really amazing though, I will give it that. Obviously a lot of people prefer that one to the remake. This is a found footage movie that takes place in an apartment building after firefighters are called for a disturbance in one of the apartments, and I think it's a really creative take on the zombie genre. And personally, I think this movie stands out from other zombie movies because of the explanation for the virus and the fact that it is found footage and taking place all in one building. I think it makes it unique from other zombie movies. I'm really picky about zombie movies, but there are a couple on this list. I also love that they keep it realistic and there's no musical score at all in this movie. It's just scored with sound effects. Oh yes, also Harold is on my blanket. Isn't that so cute? I love collecting horror blankets now. That's just what I do. Although I think it's throwing off my color balance, so we're just gonna put that over there. So anytime white is on camera, it just like throws it off anyway, sorry. I will say that the original movie of Rec is a little bit more realistic than the American version. I think because it doesn't over explain the plot and the cause of the virus like the American one does. But I think the gore and the acting and everything is done really well in the American remake, and I think it will stand the test of time because the effects are really good. And although it's made in 2008, like a lot of these movies are early 2000s, it doesn't have that essence of it, in my opinion. It doesn't have the early 2000s cheese to it, so I think this is a great remake. Speaking of cheesy, let's talk about the cheesiest movie on this list. Well, maybe it's tied for cheesiest movie, and that is Sorority Row from 2009. Again, this is a reimagined movie based on the House on Sorority Row from 1982 and follows a group of sorority sisters who cover up the accidental death of their fellow sister and then are stalked and murdered on the night of their graduation, which is 1 year later. This movie, not for everyone. I'm gonna say that. Some people are probably cringing right now that I'm including it in a best list of anything. It's not for everyone. It is very, very cheesy. My favorite part about this movie, hands down, is the death scenes and all of the gore in it. I think it's done really well and it's genuinely like disturbing to look at some of the time, but given that the movie itself is kind of lighter in tone, it's not like too dark. I have seen critics say that this movie adds nothing to the slasher genre, and while I agree to an extent because it doesn't really add anything, it is a little bit tropey, I still think it's a really, really fun movie to watch over and over again. I've seen this so many times. Again, one of my comfort movies that I put on when I don't know what else to watch. But beyond being cheesy and tropey, I can't really fault this movie because the acting is good, minus Adrena Patridge, sorry, no offense. I think the gore and suspense, what little there is really good. The story, it's a little predictable and kind of lame, but generally this movie is just really fun and I love it. And I think it's an enjoyable addition to the slasher genre and has a place. Next up is The Crazies, which came out in 2010. This is a remake of the 1973 movie done by George A. Romero, which he actually served as an executive producer on the remake as well, which I think makes it really effective. I think it's always a really good sign when some of the original crew or original writers or producers or directors or something from the original work on the remake. I think that's really important. The only exception of that was Eli Roth and Cabin Fever. That was not necessary. But it's cool that they can kind of reimagine their own movie in a way and work in a new era with new effects and a bigger budget, possibly. So The Crazies is about a fictional Iowa town that becomes infected by a virus that makes people extremely violent. Again, an original take on the zombie kind of trope, in my opinion. This is a little bit more of a traditional kind of zombie movie, but I really like the spin that they put on it, especially with the visual effects of the how the crazies or the zombies, whatever you want to call them, look. And this movie was actually received really well also, and some say it exceeds the original. And I think this is a really solid remake. Like I mentioned, the look of the zombies, each person who had to be a crazy, I don't know, I don't like calling them that for obvious reasons, but that's what it is. They had to sit in a makeup chair for 3 hours. So I think that the story behind why they look that way is really interesting, really thought out, and really intricate versus just making them look gross and like decayed. They made them look like they were filled with rage, which is really what this virus is kind of all about. So I really liked how thought out the zombies were in this movie. And although The Crazies, I think, is a little bit tropey for the genre, for the zombie subgenre. Wow, can I speak today? I still think it has really good horror elements in it. Okay, next up, House of Wax. 2005 movie. Like I said, Sorority Row was tied for cheesiest. This would be the one it's tied with. I think this got a cult following. Is it the best movie? No. Is it the best remake? No, I think it's just the cheese and I don't know, people are just drawn to this movie. So this movie is described as a loose remake of the 1953 House of Wax, which is a remake in itself of a movie from 1933 called History of the Wax Museum. Of course, this movie is notorious for starring Paris Hilton, who won a Raspberry for Worst Actress, I think, for this movie. So it's just not totally great. It won Teen Choice Awards, I guess you could say that it won something. Obviously it's gonna be a little cheesy, a lot cheesy, and obviously it's gonna have very, very early 2000s vibes going on. It just like reeks of the early 2000s in my opinion, the way they do horror, the outfits, just everything about it. It just is early 2000s, which in my opinion is a plus. It's not for everyone. However, I think this movie does a really good job of building the atmosphere. I think it's a really good pick if you're in the mood for cheese and not something super serious. I'm not sure that the horror elements aged well, but it's still a really enjoyable movie and like a fun movie. It probably is one of the worst rated movies on this list and seen as like a guilty pleasure movie for a lot of people, but I had to put it on here. I mean, it's just iconic. Okay, I promise not all of these movies are from the early 2000s, just 7 out of 10 are from the early 2000s. That was like the era of remakes. I say we're in the era now. I think we've been in the era since like the late 90s. We've been in the era of remakes and reboots. Anyway, but let's talk about another early 2000s remake. Dawn of the Dead came out in 2004. This is another zombie one. I think it's actually the tropiest one on this list. I mean, it has the very traditional type of zombie, not the slow walkers like the original Dawn of the Dead, and George A. Romero's zombies were a little bit slow moving and less scary. I like the fast zombies, such as in the Dawn of the Dead remake. So it is the tropiest, but I think in the best way possible, because I think that the horror elements are good. This one follows a group of survivors in a zombie outbreak that take refuge inside a Wisconsin shopping mall. And this is kind of the exception to what I said earlier when you're doing a remake and you want to entice old fans to go and see it. The producer for this, Eric Newman, had said that he wanted to reimagine George A. Romero's original and kind of create it for a younger audience and a newer audience who hadn't seen the original. So I thought that was an interesting choice to go into recreating this story. And I do think that this movie it has a great balance of working with the inspiration of the original while still making it his own and making it fit the times and appealing to a new audience. But I think it's still got the old fans, like the original fans and everything, excited for it too. I don't think zombie movies are particularly scary, at least for me. This one isn't too scary, but I really like the suspense and the horror elements in this one specifically, and I think it aged well, so I'm gonna say it's a great remake. Okay, let's talk about a movie that is not an early 2000s movie, and this one might be a stretch, I'm not sure. The Invisible Man from this year. So this movie is loosely based on the H.G. Wells book of the same name and a loose recreation of the 1933 Universal monster. And obviously, this is a very clearly inspired by, not a direct remake. I mean, given all the modern updates, the technology that goes on in this movie, this is a very much reimagined telling, taking the concept of the Invisible Man, the original, and kind of using it and creating its own story. I mean, the story's not the same, the character's not the same, the plot isn't, like, nothing is the same, just inspired by. Obviously, the new one follows a woman who is abused, and we don't really see much of the Invisible Man as a character like in the original. He's not really a character. We're following the main protagonist who is like fighting the Invisible Man versus the original. That being said, I really love this movie. I think Lee Wannell as a director was the perfect choice for it. I love his work anyway, and I like this movie so much more than I thought. I did a full review already, so I'm not going to go too into like reviewing it in itself, but I will link the review if you want to go watch that to know my thoughts. But I had to put it on this list because I think, although it's not a direct remake, or maybe not even a remake at all besides the name. I think it's a great movie. Okay, so the last movie we're gonna talk about, one of the best horror remakes, Last House on the Left from 2009. This is a remake of the 1972 movie, and it is also one of those situations where the original producer of the first one, Wes Craven, worked on this one as well. And this one specifically, he wanted to remake with his new production company because he was able to get a larger budget, as opposed to when he made it in the 70s. He had to cut a lot of things out because of the smaller budget. So he wanted to see how he could reimagine the story given the bigger budget. Now, obviously this movie is famously disturbing, and huge trigger warning for this movie. I think I've only seen it the one time, maybe twice, maybe. It's hard to watch for me anyway. I think it is done so well, so it's very believable. It's very realistic. I love the actors in it. They actually brought in a medical technician to oversee the death scenes and to kind of explain how the body or someone would react to certain things in the movie, so it made it feel that much more realistic. The only thing that makes it a little less realistic is their choice of hurting or killing characters in a really weird, grotesque, creative way. I guess that's how you would describe it. Kind of like the Saw movies, you know? Which is funny because they specifically said that they were trying to avoid becoming a torture porn movie like the Saw movies, when they kind of had a little bit of that going on, in my opinion. So this is a really well done movie. It's one of the better remakes that I've ever seen personally. It's just not so much a rewatch kind of movie because it is so realistic and disturbing to me, but it is amazing if you haven't seen it yet. I think everyone should see it once, but big trigger warning before going into it. I would look up the specifics of that trigger warning as well. By the way, there is a website called doesthedogdie.com. I will link it down below. You can put in any of your triggers or look up movies to see if anything is in it, including like vomiting or animals dying or, you know, sexual abuse or anything like that. It'll tell you what movies have that in it, which is amazing. It's a great resource. So I will link it down below. I get questions all the time like, well, does the animal die in that, and things like that. So you can always look it up. Just want to point that out. It's great as horror fans to have that because we don't want to be bombarded by our trauma. Anyway, so those are 10 more good horror remakes, best horror remakes in my opinion. Please tell me yours down below. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.